despicable image. We don't know its source. We don't know who sent it. But it is a shocking and despicable image. We are against all forms of violence, even in the form of an image. We are not required to apologize on behalf of a lunatic.
That's Professor Ibrahim Abu Muhammad. He's the spiritual leader of Australia's Muslims. And responding there on ABC TV's Lateline to an image that, once seen, is hard to unsee. An image that raises an awful lot of questions. You'll have seen it or heard about it, I'm sure. A boy holding up the severed head, and he needs two hands to do it. The severed head of a slain Syrian soldier, his dad. Sydney man, jihadist, Khaled Sharif, tweets proudly, "That's my boy." It's profoundly disturbing and has fueled discussion this week of Islam, of radicalisation, of jihad, of the challenges posed to the Australian way of life, of how our government ought to respond, how we as ordinary people ought to respond. Radicalisation, terror, what are they doing, breeding in our suburbs? To discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Greg Barton. He's Director of the Global Terrorism Research Centre at Melbourne's Monash University, heading up the Radicalisation Project. Roger Shanahan's with you too. Roger has a distinguished military and academic career. He's now a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute. Dr. Jan Ali is Senior Lecturer in Islam and Modernity at the University of Western Sydney. These ideas are fresh in his mind. He's just returned from the 2014 Oxford Roundtable for Public Critical Issues, where he presented a paper on the sociology of Muslim terror, its causes and consequences. And psychiatrist and writer Dr. Tanveer Ahmed joins you too. His heritage is Bangladeshi Muslim. Welcome to you all. Jan, if I can start with you, a really basic definitional thing here. It's an expression used pretty freely, but I wonder what it actually means. What is a radicalised Muslim?
There are many different explanations and definitions of a radicalised Muslim, but if we look at the New South Wales counter-terrorism definition, it is where a particular individual shows or expresses tendency towards inflicting harm to a fellow human individual, or showing tendency to engage in some kind of structural destruction, whether that be a bridge, a building. But again, people might have different definitions and it needs qualification.
That seems, Greg Barton, quite an extreme position. Wondering how does that happen? How do people get to that point? Do we know who this sort of way of thinking might appeal to?
When we talk about extreme, what we're talking about here is violent extremism. People can have strong views, we might say extreme views, but they're non-violent. They get there by association with a social network, by their friends. So they don't wake up one morning and have a head full of crazy ideas. They don't even get it by looking at the internet. They get it by their peer network and the people that draw them in on a steady path of very extreme ideas until they take violent action. But it's that social network which is key.
Tanveer, you've written this week that Australian Muslims need to take more responsibility for those radicalised people within their midst. Explain your thinking there.
Look, I think there's often an argument that the radicalised are just these lunatics, or that there's no connection with them and the types of thinking. And we've just heard from Greg talking about often there isn't actually a great deal of difference between the beliefs that many Muslims have as opposed to the beliefs the people willing to commit violence. It's a bit like, say, Marxists in the day. They had their red kind of terrorists. They're willing to commit violence, and it's with a whole range of groups. My argument, it begins usually in social life as adolescents, where they feel like they can't participate in Western social life. And becoming religious is this way of almost showing their identity, if you like. This is my identity. And in part, their identity begins in part in opposition to Western life.
I beg to differ with Tanveer. I think it is a lack of religiosity that actually brings them into that kind of state, because that will then suggest that it's the religion that's radicalizing these individuals, and I totally disagree. No religion in the world, whether that be Islam or Hinduism or Christianity, actually promotes any kind of
I disagree, because it's actually widely studied. So Pew studies, British studies, show that Muslims become more religious. Now, it doesn't automatically follow that Islam is the cause then, but in Western life, they become more religious. It's a different type of religion to their parents. It's more one about identity assertion. They want to have it less tied to their cultural background. But it is in part tied to an opposition to Western mainstream life.
Well, it may be related to cultural religious activities, but not necessarily scriptural religion or scriptural Islam in this sense.
Greg Barton, can I bring you in on that? I mean, what does the study show about the people we've looked at who have become radicalised? I mean, what's the role of religion in that?
Well, both John and Tony have good points. The typical stories we see are somebody comes from a family that's not particularly religious. They get an interest in religion, perhaps because of identity issues, seeking a sense of who they are. If they then are befriended by some mentors who give them a positive role model and positive instruction in religion, it all ends well. But if they're taken off in a direction by a group that claims to know and speaks in very black and white terms of great certainty and confidence and charisma, but with very dangerous ideas, then somebody can very quickly end up going down a dangerous path.
Roger Shanahan, to bring you in too, the response from government, from the security apparatus in a place like Australia is to crack down, as we've seen in this past week or so, to impose restrictions, to beef up national security. Is that an effective strategy?
Well, it's not the only strategy and can never be the only strategy, but there has to be a punitive element because governments ultimately, their prime responsibility is safety of its citizens. So the other element is a preventative element, and that's where the community is really key, because governments, for people who are likely to go down these paths, are normally seen as part of the problem and not part of the solutions. Government's not going to be able to influence these kind of people. All they can do is create boundaries for them. But it's an issue of education as well. One of the things that you tend to see is normally low levels of education, so the whole notion of critical analysis, and also from their parents who haven't been schooled in this notion of critical analysis. The point that Greg brought up, when things go well, if you're impressionable and you're giving your impressions by somebody who's responsible, but if you fall into the circles of people who aren't, if you're being brought up in a family environment where, again, you're not exposed to critical thinking, then you're much more vulnerable to this.
John Ali, the radicalisation of young Muslims almost feels like a sort of a Western cultural failure. Is that an unhelpful way to look at it?
I think radicalization, sociologically speaking, is a social problem or emanates from social crisis. I think Roger was right in saying about families, about the issue of education, and what's been said about critical thinking then it becomes very important, especially when someone is trying to educate you religiously. Do you accept the authority of the religious leader and accept it to be true, or do you actually think critically about it and therefore act rationally? So unfortunately, the social conditions for many people in this situation doesn't allow that, and unfortunately we see the negative outcome of that.
Greg Barton, how universal is the process of radicalisation? I mean, what similarities can we draw between radical Islam or the IRA or Weather Underground?
From studies we've done at Monash, it seems not to matter what the ideology is. There are common patterns, whether it's extreme right, extreme left, extreme environmental activist, jihadi Islamist. It's the social networks. It's being drawn into an exclusivist community that breaks its contact with the outside world, eventually moves into a point of protest that uses violence and then makes a sharp rupture. The ideas come in after the socialisation, and it doesn't seem to matter which ideology or religious tradition we're talking about, it's much the same process.
Well, presumably, if we want to do something about it, then it's that point of socialisation that offers us the greatest scope for intervening.
Absolutely. If we put it in sort of very simple terms, it's much the same dynamics we see with young men, teenagers, 20-something young men getting into trouble, whether it's juvenile crime, gangs, substance abuse, same sorts of patterns, the same sorts of interventions. If there's a vacuum, somebody's struggling, they're suffering from poor self-esteem, they don't feel that they belong, maybe part of their own migrant background that exacerbates that, If somebody steps in and reaches out a hand and helps them find a sense of belonging, then that's good. But if that's the wrong hand, it's the wrong person, it can take them in a bad direction.
Yeah, I think what Greg was saying was a good point. The modern version of young people becoming religious, it can be compared to disaffected youth, say, becoming punks or goths. It's kind of like this alternate tribe initially. And then it's the process from there that can lead to radicalisation. Jan is right on one level talking about the actual radicalisation process often took place away from, say, the mainstream mosques. It happened in the school hall, it happened in the social network, so it certainly wasn't in the mainstream arenas. But I also think Jan illustrates a key point where there's a wholesale denial, often in Muslim communities, that it has anything to do with the religion or anything to do with the community, that it's somehow completely separate. Arguably, and this is studied in other areas, like, say, the growth of Islamic schools, etc., more than any other community, the Islamic community has the highest tendency to have cultural maintenance. In many respects, they would fear or be suspicious of the broader Western life. And this is something I see amongst parents. So often when kids are becoming religious, parents are initially quite proud of that. They're like, oh, fantastic. And it's rare that they may actually look at that and think, oh, actually, is there a problem here? Is something going wrong? You look at some of the kids who went from Britain to Syria, the parents had no idea, and they were told the kids went on some sort of religious trip. And initially I thought, oh, it's great, they're getting religious, that'll keep them out of trouble, keep them on the right path. In my view, there is huge amounts of denial, huge amounts of just avoidance that contribute to the problem.
We're talking about radicalisation, in particular Muslim radicalisation, here on Sunday Extra. Jan Ali, Greg Barton, Tanveer Ahmed and Roger Shanahan joining you. Roger, I mean, our response to this is, I guess, and it makes sense, is to we would talk about the 150 Australians overseas, is to look at people at almost the final stage of that radicalisation and respond often in a fairly punitive way. Is that a circular process? Is that self-perpetuating? Do we clamp down and therefore feed the bottom end of that chain, which leads to that extreme radicalisation?
Well, again, I think, as I said before, you really don't, if you're the government, you don't have many choices. If your most serious responsibility is protection of your citizens. I think one of the issues which Tanveer touched on is the issue of the community and also the community leadership, that it's either a combination of denial or just an unfamiliarity with the way to communicate with people. And I think in particular, one of the problems with the Muslim community in Australia, besides its fractured nature, fractured along ethnic lines, fractured internally, is a real inability to understand what a potential problem is and to try and head it off, and a real notion of what it takes to be a community leader. To be a community leader in mainstream Australia, you need to shape the debate. You don't need to be reactive to the debate. And, the first Australian killed in Syria occurred over 2 years ago, but you really never heard any of the Muslim community leaders being on the front foot about what this meant for the community. And here we are 2 years down the track, and you get amnesty on Lateline over 2 years after the event. And if you look at the Muslim community websites, there's hardly anything about this issue. It is as if it doesn't exist, but on most of them, you can find a press release about the situation in Gaza. So it's externalising issues. It's not really, again, it's this notion of critical analysis, and I think the Muslim leadership really needs to have taken ownership of this and led the community and shaped the debate, and they've done, certainly haven't done the latter and haven't done enough of the former.
It seems to be a combination, Greg Barton, of denial on that sense that Roger points out there, but also a failure to understand what might be the most effective interdiction, if you like, on the part of broader Australian culture. I mean, what's the best way to influence this as a movement, to nip this at the bud before it escalates into the extremities of radicalisation?
There's no silver bullet solution, no singular solution, but there's been a lot of work done over the last 10, 15 years on violent extremism. Northern Europe, UK, Australia particularly, we now speak conceptually of countering violent extremism, which implies getting upstream, working with youth at risk, basically filling a void with productive, positive social networks, activities, involving them in the community. We need to intervene too when people have been radicalised, particularly when they've been imprisoned, and try and work on disengaging them from violent extremism. But there's been a tendency to, I guess, disparage countering violent extremist approach, CB approaches as being soft and unfocused. When the Cameron government came in the UK, they cut the prevent budget from £62 million to £30 million. They quickly reversed that when they faced problems. And there was a bit of a sense last year that both the Gillard government and the Abbott government were backing away and saying, let's move on from this and let's not talk about CVE. But actually, for lessons learned, we need to be doing a raft of things that includes engaging with communities in ways which might seem kind of soft and unfocused, but really pay off.
John, a final question to you, sort of an existential one. Where does this end? How does this ultimately resolve?
Well, I think Greg is absolutely right. I think in terms of addressing the issue, I'm not sure where does it end though, but I think one of the most important ways, I believe, and this is what our research indicated looking at the New South Wales counter-terrorism model, is that the community engagement model, where the police, for instance, engages with the community in a positive and productive way, where the community is involved in identifying radicalised youth or those who are on the path to that status. And this needs to be done in cooperation with the community. So police, the politicians and welfare organisations plus the Muslim community need to operate together. And one way to promote, I suppose, the engagement model is to make Muslim community members become aware of what services are there for them to use, so that they can, for instance, report any incidences of radicalisation or any suspicion. And also, I think it is important for the police in particular to educate the community. It's not targeting a particular group, but it is for the betterment of both Muslim community and community in large. And I think education in that sense is very important. And also diverting the attention of the youth away from radicalised imams or places where this kind of activity takes place. I don't know where they are, by the way, but not so much take a punitive action against those people, but to take a proactive approach. After all, they are Australian citizens, and we want to make people better people.
Making people better people might be a worthy objective in all of this. A complex discussion, but thanks to all our participants this morning. Professor Greg Barton is Director of the Global Terrorism Research Centre, Monash University. Roger Shanahan too, from a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute in Sydney. Dr. Jan Ali, Senior Lecturer in Islam and Modernity at the University of Western Sydney, and psychiatrist and writer, Dr. Tanveer Ahmed. Sunday.
Yeah, well, isn't it interesting that they make no mention of the fact that it's perfectly acceptable for an Australian to go overseas and join the military of any national government. So Australians with Australian passports are going to Israel and signing up with the Israeli Defence Forces, and they're going off and committing atrocities in Gaza, and that's all A-OK, that's acceptable. Australians on secondment with the British Navy fought in the Falkland Islands War against Argentina, and that's quite okay. And at the moment, the Australian military contingent to Afghanistan has killed more members of the Australian military contingent to Afghanistan than the Taliban did when we actually had boots on the ground over there the whole time. Right? Australian Afghan military veterans have killed twice as many Australian Afghan military veterans as the Taliban did. And that's okay. That's not considered to be radicalising and militarising the youth of the nation and turning them into extremists who come back traumatised and depersonalised and bitter and twisted and likely to commit violent acts in society. Pretty sure that fella who holed up in the Barrington Tops for 2 or 3 years after committing murder down in the river end, I'm pretty sure he was a military veteran. So why is it unacceptable for Australian Moslems to go around the world and get sick of all their military bullshit ideology in some other country and then come back home as a shell-shock, post-traumatic stress disorder affected war veteran? It's a double standard that pisses me off greatly. If Australia's allowed to send Australians overseas and fight for the Australian government and come back fucked in the head, why aren't the Australian Muslims allowed to go and fight for whatever stupid bloody idea they think they need to shoot at strangers for? Anyway, that's just my take on it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.